So tonight's event is the Hoppensteins 120 years of an Edinburgh Jewish family with Fiona Frank. So we're delighted to have Fiona here tonight. And let me just give you a little bit of background about Fiona. Fiona Frank has a BA in European Studies from the University of Bath, a Masters of Education from the University of Sheffield in Adult Literary Studies, and a PhD from Strathclyde University in Scottish Jewish Identity. After 20 years working in adult education and educational research at Lancaster University, she moved to a position with SCOJEC, the Scottish Council of Jewish Communities. And since 2011, until she retired recently, she was their Projects and Outreach Manager, carrying out research and organising events for Scotland's Jewish communities. Fiona's a very busy lady, and one of her big projects that she's going to be concentrating on in the future is promoting the art of her aunt, Glasgow artist Hannah Frank. So that's Fiona, and I think we're in for a real treat tonight with this talk based on Fiona's book, which I'm sure Fiona will tell you more about later on. We have muted everybody except people that are speaking, which will be Fiona and some members of her family. So please, if you find yourself unmuted, please mute yourself again during the talk, so as we don't get any background noise. Anyway, I hope you're going to enjoy the talk, and I'll now hand over to Fiona.
Thank you. Right, so I'm going to remove the spotlight from David, and off we go. I'm joined today by some very special guests. So what I'd like to ask you to do is, up on the top right-hand side of your thing, if you put your thing on gallery view, you should be able to see everybody. And now if everybody who isn't a member of the Hoppenstein family would turn off your video temporarily, then you'll see, then that'll leave everybody, all the people with videos. If you go, you can go right through the screen, and there's David Callin, Ivor Callin, Barbara Hertz, who else is there? Let me find some more Hoppensteins here. There's David Stone, Judith Stone, Richard Stone, Hamish Callin, Ailsa Gardner, Ken Hertz, Barbara Spivak, Hugh Hope Stone, Leslie Kaplan. Hi Leslie, just arrived. And it's absolutely lovely to see all of these people here. I'm going to put myself back onto Spotlight, and that should put me back in the middle there. So we've got at least 11 or 12 people that were part of the people that I interviewed, and I'm very happy to have them here with me. I'm going to talk mainly, and then before we open it up for questions, I'm going to be offering the people that I interviewed a chance to comment on what I've said. So I shall start. About 14 years ago, I decided that I might want to do some sort of master's degree for some reason. And I had the idea that I could see in Lancaster, where I lived, the current immigrant generation looking very visible, very visibly Muslim, with long white jellabas and long beards. And I started to think about what our Jewish immigrant grandparents would have looked like 100 years ago, and how they would have looked. And they would have looked probably a lot more visibly Jewish than many of us look now. But now, 120 years later, after the first immigrants came, obviously lots of different Jews have immigrated to Scotland in many different times, but my lot came around 120 years ago. Even though most of us pass in the societies in which we live, and we don't look particularly visibly Jewish, we've integrated, but what we haven't done is assimilated, a good many of us, which means there's still a distinctive Jewish culture and identity that we've kept, however long we've been educated in and worked in and lived in the secular society. So I thought it would be quite interesting to do a contrasting study about the Muslims in Lancaster now and the Jews in Scotland, the Jews in Glasgow, where my grandparents came to 100 years ago. So a contrasting study about the Muslims in Lancaster now and the Jews in Glasgow 100 years ago. And I felt this could be of use to the current immigrant generations, giving them hope that their culture and identity would still be apparent and persisting 100 years later. So that's where I started from. And I started reading around the subject, and I found a book that looked interesting. And I found that Bill Williams was using this book as one of the set books of an undergraduate course that he was doing at the Centre for Jewish Studies in Manchester University on Jewish identity. So I made an appointment with him to see if I could meet him and talk to him, and maybe he'd let me go and audit his undergraduate class, a 5-week course. And I went and had a chat with him. And by the end of that hour's conversation, I was a bit surprised to find that I was enrolled on a PhD in oral history at Manchester University Centre for Jewish Studies. That wasn't actually my intention, but it was a very exciting thing anyway. And I just rolled with it. So Bill decided he wanted to train me in oral history. And I had a grade 9 for history O level, which in those days, grade 9 was the worst grade. I think now it's the best grade, but it certainly wasn't then. So it caused a few worries to the admissions panel at the university, but I had been working at Lancaster Uni in educational research for about 10 years, and I was a trained ethnographer, and I'd done lots of research interviews, but not particularly oral history. But I'd learned deep listening through counselling training, so I had those kinds of skills. And for the project, initially, Bill and I decided that we would find about 20 random Glasgow Jews and interview them and see what came up about issues of Scottish Jewish identity. And he asked me to find a Jewish Glaswegian based near Manchester for my first interviewee, so he could go with me, do the interview, and train me in oral history techniques. So we started off. I was at an art exhibition for my aunt Hannah Frank's art in 2003 in Lancaster, and I met a lady from Lancaster who told me that her daughter was married to a Scottish Jewish man, and the father-in-law lived in South Manchester. So Bill and I went off to meet Arthur Stone, and I'm now going to share my screen. And here is a picture of Arthur Stone. Sadly, he died 2 years ago, but I'm very pleased to say that his widow Judith Stone's here and his 2 sons, Michael and Richard. Arthur was the self-appointed family historian. It was an unusual interview because he read to us from his memoir, which you can see it typed there, which he later gave us. He showed me the family tree that he'd made. He talked about who he was, his family name, his mother's family name, his father's name, and lots more about his father's family and his mother's family. And as an educationalist, I was fascinated by one bit of what he told us, which was that although he was quite an Orthodox Jew and he'd had various committee positions in his synagogue, he chose not to send his children, that is Richard and Michael who are here, to the Jewish school in Manchester. He felt that it was kind of ghettoizing. And here we go again with some quotes. Come on, off you go. Wouldn't it be nice if it's shared properly? Right. He felt it was ghettoizing, that they needed to be part of the secular world. They didn't go to Jewish day school. I'm actually not convinced whether this is the right way and whether integration is not a better way to stand up to. I think I've got a more broader outlook, he said. I think anybody like myself has got a more broader outlook, like somebody that didn't go to a Jewish school. They're not subjected to it, you see, till they're older. I have to say that it's a narrow outlook on things if you go to a Jewish school. So that was what Arthur told me about that. And after we'd finished the interview with Arthur, I typed it up and Bill and I discussed it. And then he told me I needed to get another couple of interviews and we'd look at them together and decide where to go next. And the next thing was that my mum met a Scottish lady, Gertie Callin, in her synagogue in St Anne's, who had come over there to the seaside for a day trip from Liverpool. They got talking and she said that her son Ivor, who's here today, wanted to come to a new music concert in Lancaster and could he stay with me? And so Ivor and his wife Jenny came to stay. Ivor's here, as I said, and Ivor's brother David and Ivor's son Hamish is here, which is lovely. So I went to the concert in Lancaster that Ivor was going to. I knew music is really not my scene, but it was a lovely social occasion and Ivor's a lovely person. And then he agreed that I could go down to London and interview him for this project. So it was a fascinating interview. And Ivor told me that he was atheist and anti-Zionist, and he didn't feel that he had a lot in common with a lot of the Jews in Glasgow. And I ended up actually naming my PhD about, come on, off you go, naming my PhD after Ivor's quote, "An outsider wherever I am," because he said he felt like he didn't feel at home in Glasgow because everybody was too Zionist. He didn't feel at home in London because he was too Scottish, and it was a very sort of poignant comment that he made, and it was very nice to be able to use it for the title of my PhD. But he had chosen to send his children to a Jewish school in London, or they anyway, partly because he could, and it was a good way to get a good education. They had good standards, and partly because what he said was they can get all the Jewish stuff at school, and then he wouldn't have to bother with it at home. So here you go. We want them to have some sort of Jewish identity. If we go to the local primary school, then we're going to have to do all the work on the Jewish identity and drag them to shul. And I really didn't enjoy that much. Or we're going to have to find other Jews and alternative Jewishy things. I'm just putting words into Ivor's mouth here. He is actually here and he could say it for me, but I'm saying it. I shall open this up to Ivor later. Or we send them to the Jewish school where they'll get all that stuff dealt with and we don't have to worry about it, and we'll just have to balance things up so they have a perspective that the whole world isn't Jewish. And that's what they went with. So I thought that was quite interesting. And then some years earlier, I'd interviewed my uncle Lionel, who is also the uncle of my sister Lynn, who's here, and Barbara and Eva Spivak, who are here. And he's the husband of my auntie Hannah, because I was thinking of doing an early years of literacy project in my previous life. And I interviewed him about his early memories of school. And a couple of things really jumped out of his interview at me. Something that happened in the classroom on his first day at school. What's the first thing that you ever remember learning at school? And I think all the Scottish Jews will know this one. Being threatened or assaulted by Roman Catholic children at the accompanying school. They get to hold of you and say, are you a Billy or a Dan? I don't know which one it was. I think it was a Billy, you got off lightly, but a Dan, you were in for a bit of thrashing about Roman Catholic upbringing. And of course the Jews weren't anywhere in there. He had no idea what this was about because the Jews got it both ways, he said. And then the next thing that he said was that the Jews, so the kids outside made him different, but also he made himself different. The Jew boys, as we were called, went home early on Fridays because we had to attend synagogue. So we got up and walked out at 3:30 or whenever it was. And then you enter a different world. You put on Sabbath clothes to look more respectful. You'd have ceremonial things on the table. And more than anywhere else, he said this, you realized that you belonged to a different race. This was a life that he wasn't that religious, my Uncle Lionel, but he said it like this. This was a life that the poor little Protestant chaps didn't get the chance of enjoying that. We were different. We were chosen by the Lord as his people. And he said all this completely, like totally seriously. He was lost in the moment and it was right to observe all his customs. And he said in the same way that the book by David Deichers, Two Worlds, about the Salis Deichers, the rabbi of Edinburgh, he called his book Two Worlds, and Uncle Lionel talked about the same thing. You could, like with magic, you could move from one world to another without thinking about it. At one time you were friendly with Tommy and Bill and so on. And at another time you realized that you had different kinds of lives. So that was very interesting, looking at how Uncle Lionel was treated differently by the kids outside the school and treated differently, and he felt himself to be different when he talked about seamlessly going between the two worlds. And these first three interviews were very different kinds of perspectives about education. And then I realized that each of these three interviewees were part of the same family. It was a big coincidence, seeing as I'd come across each of them in completely different ways. My Uncle Lionel was Arthur Stone's first cousin. I'd met Arthur Stone's brother Fred at my aunt's 90th birthday party, but I hadn't met Arthur and I didn't come across him that way. And Gertie Callum was another first cousin, and they were all grandchildren of Rabbis V. David Hoppenstein and his wife Sophia. So here's a family tree to explain where we are. Come on. So we have, you won't be able to see it very clearly, but at the top we've got V. David Hoppenstein and his wife Sophia. They had 9 children. in the second generation here. In the third generation, the third one along was Lionel Levy, and then over here was Arthur Stone, and then next to Arthur Stone is Gertie Callin, and down here was Ivor Callin. So they were all members of the same family, and descendants of Rabbi Zvi David Hoppenstein. And here is, and on the right is his wife Sophia and his oldest daughter Eva, their oldest daughter Eva, and their first grandson Harold, who later went on to become the Chief Rabbi's Inspector of Hebrew Education, which I bet some of you in this room had coming to inspect your Hebrew classes, and Harold's father, Morris. So that's who all those photos are. And everybody that I had interviewed was related to this family, which was really quite exciting because they were so different, and I had an interest in educational differences. And because Arthur Stone had already done loads of work on the family tree, and I knew the names of all the other cousins and quite a few of the children's names, I thought it'd be an interesting project to try and trace all the living descendants of the rabbi and his wife, who came to Edinburgh in the 1880s and had 9 children. Because there was an Orthodox and very religious beginning to this family, it wouldn't be a random set of Scottish Jews as I'd originally planned to interview. It'd be interesting to see what had happened to that religiosity and Orthodox Judaism as it trickled down through the family, if I could find all of the Hoppensteins and if they all agreed to be interviewed. So it was a bit risky. I already knew Arthur's brother Fred, and I'd also met my uncle's brother and sister and his niece Doreen and nephew David and their families. Doreen died 2 years ago. Her daughters Eva and Barbara are here tonight. So I was already, back to the family tree, I was already in touch with, if you look along the second row, if you can see my cursor moving, I was already in touch with Eva's children. Then Abraham, the second one didn't have any children. Third one didn't have any children. Sydney was one I wasn't in touch with. Beatty was one we weren't in touch with. Marcus we were in touch with. Lily didn't have children. Moss didn't have children. And Esther or Kuti, we were in touch with that family. So there were 2 branches of the family that we weren't in touch with. And those branches were branches where the cousins had married out, and they weren't in the general social networks. They weren't meeting up at everybody's bar mitzvahs and weddings and so on like the rest of the Jewish family were. But we knew, but as a kind of coincidence, Fred Stone, who was an eminent child psychiatrist, was on the board of Young Minds, a mental health charity. And at the time that I was doing my interviews, Barbara Hertz, who's one of the 3rd generation, was their chief executive. So Fred Stone introduced me to Barbara, who's here today, and I was able to interview her, and she put me in touch with her brother Ken, who's here today, and her sister Ailsa, who's here today, and I interviewed them, which was great, and met Ailsa's daughter as well. The last branch of the family, Sydney's descendants, what had happened was Maury and Harold's parents, Sydney and Dolly, had both died when they were very young. Maury and Harold had both married out, and like the Hertz family, they weren't part of the wider family social networks. But I knew Sydney had changed his name to Hope-Stone from Hoppenstein. So I Googled that and I found Hugh Hopestone, who's here tonight. I contacted him. He's a researcher himself, so he was happy to be interviewed after he kind of grilled me to make sure I wasn't some sort of spam person. And I was also very excited that his father had just completed his own memoir called No Stone Unturned, which was very excited that Hugh sent me a copy of it, a PDF of it, and then he arranged for me to visit his dad, and he gave me a copy of the book, which is signed. And I met him, and then I met his uncle and aunt, Maury and Betty Hopestone, and I met his cousin Leslie, who was living in Cape Town. who is here again tonight through the wonders of Zoom. We have the South African family here as well. And I was able to interview the whole family. I interviewed Leslie by phone at the time. But that was how I established my project. I was going to be interviewing all the living descendants of the family, as many of them who would speak to me. It was very lucky that only 2 members of the family didn't want to be involved, which is a pretty high hit rate, really. There's a closed set of people that I could have included in the study. And if most of them had decided they didn't want to be part of it, that would have been dead in the water, but it worked out okay. And at the same time as traveling around the country doing interviews, I also did some secondary research, which was finding out about the early years of the family. And I thought I'd share a few things from there. For example, the naturalization certificate of Svi David Hoppenstein, which is a fascinating and beautiful bit of documentation. So this is the first page, and it says, Mr. Hoppenstein resides at 18 Caledonian Place and is a teacher of Hebrew and a hawker of jewellery, which was something that a lot of our ascendants did. He is a native of Poland and came to this country in 1882. I have seen all the references, with the exception of referee Mr. McKay, who is presently from home. They are all respectable men and confirm their declarations. Referee Mr. McRae states that applicant led him to understand that the reason for seeking naturalization was because he was afraid that the Jews might be expelled from this country. The applicant now states that he wishes to be naturalized in order that he might become a British subject, as he prefers the laws of this country to that of his own. He further states that it is his intention to reside in the United Kingdom. And it goes on to say, we, the undersigned, natural-born British subjects, householders, and neither of us the agent or solicitor of the memorialist, do solemnly and sincerely declare that the applicant, David Hoppenstein, with his address, a subject of Russia, Poland, a married man with 6 children, a teacher by calling, he's lost the hawking by page 2, is a fit and proper person to be granted a certificate of naturalization, and we furthermore vouch for his respectability and loyalty. We make this solemn declaration conscientiously believing the same to be true, and by virtue of an act made and passed in the 5th and 6th years of His late Majesty, King William IV. And I thought it was quite interesting to see this, considering as these days you have to do English tests, which I don't think he would have passed at the time, and life in the UK tests. But what has puzzled me is how on earth he managed to make contact with 4 upstanding householders, natural-born British subjects, because I have a feeling that he kept himself to himself and lived among the Jews. So I'd be interested in all the historians among you, whether you've had a look at whether the people that signed the naturalization certificates of your grandparents had natural relations with the first person. So the certificate cost £5, which seems to be worth about £1,000 today, so a little bit cheaper than getting your citizenship, but not much. And you can see that the family lived in Caledonian Place when he got his naturalization papers. We have records of 8 addresses during the time they lived in Edinburgh. He got in a rabbinical post in Ayrshire in about 2012 for a couple of years, and then moved to Glasgow, where his son Marcus was setting up in business. I did a bit of, these are the addresses that we found from a birth certificate and another birth certificate and another birth certificate and the naturalization certificate and the census and an inscription on a book and the Jewish Chronicle and a trade directory. And they had 9 children and they moved at least 8 times, and it must have been completely exhausting. I did a bit of investigation looking at local records, but couldn't tell whether they were moving into larger tenement flats around Edinburgh for the growing family, or whether they were moving into smaller places because they didn't have much money and couldn't afford the rent. But I do know that being a hawker of jewellery and a cheder teacher didn't pay much, especially when you have 9 children. We know a bit about his life. I wonder if I put this, I think I probably forgot. Yes, I did forget to put the, oh no, I did do that. So this is let me just share this. This is when it says he lived in 150. Which one's that? Oh, that's not his address. That's an inscription. That's when he lived in Glasgow a little bit later on. Another address that he had. And I just thought you might like to see the rabbi's handwriting. This was I got the Reverend Aaron Sudri to translate this for me. This is a complicated acrostic poem that he wrote to Uncle Lionel on the occasion of the wedding anniversary. And it's got an acrostic. One of these, the letters on the right-hand side will make up a poem. And I've got 3 pages of explanation for it on here. And it was like a puzzle that Aaron Sudri very much enjoyed trying to sort out. And here's a little bit about him in the Jewish Chronicle. The services at the Dalrai Synagogue were conducted by the Reverend Cohen, assisted by Mr. Radin and Mr. Hoppenstein, who was president, who also acted as Baltakaias. And on the second day, Mr. Hoppenstein delivered a lecture from the text, Isaiah, whatever it was. So he was active in the Jewish community, and he was also getting work wherever he could, teaching Hebrew. And as far as I know, he was also a shohet, but wasn't particularly successful economically, financially, but very, very learned. And everything was about learning and about Jewish learning and Jewish culture. So at the same time that I was doing this secondary research and looking in archives, looking up censuses, looking up and spending time in the Scottish Jewish archives, a lot helped along by the staff at the archives, Harvey Kaplan and Fiona Brodie, who's here tonight. And I was also helped a lot by the librarian of the archives, the late Rosa Sakharin, who was really helpful and who lived across the road from Ivor and David when they were growing up by coincidence. And as archival research, I also used wills, which give a very interesting perspective on class, as you see what people leave when they die, and I'll come back to that if there's time. So when I started talking to the family, which I was doing at the same time as looking at the archival stuff, I found that the story of outmarriage was quite an interesting one and was mirrored. The families where the parents hadn't married out had their own stories to tell about the families, the men who had disappeared because they'd gone off to marry, they'd gone off and married out, and they hadn't been seen again for a number of years. Leslie Hertz, for example, married a non-Jewish woman, Muriel Bar Doctor, and changed and moved from Glasgow to Plymouth, as far as you can possibly go, more or less. They got married in Paisley Abbey, and he changed his name from Hertz, H-E-R-T-Z, to H-E-R-T-S. We don't know whether his wife's family, the Bars, even knew he was Jewish. We doubt it. In Paisley Abbey, I don't think they taught very much about marrying Jews there. He never told his parents that he was married, and they had 3 for a while anyway. So they had 3 children, Barbara and Ken and Ailsa, who are here, as I've already said. Although that family would probably have thought that they were cut off from the Hoppenstein family because of having married out, Uncle Moss, or Uncle Mausch, the youngest boy, the youngest son of Svi David and Sophia, came to visit Leslie in Plymouth and in Leicester. But Leslie never told Uncle Moss that he was married with children, and never told the children that they had Jewish grandparents, or Scottish grandparents even, or Jewish heritage, until when the children were 11, 12 and 13, I think something like that. Leslie got ill, or more ill, with multiple sclerosis, and his wife thought it was important that his family should know. So she got in touch with the family. In fact, she phoned the family doctor to ask if he could let the family know that their son Leslie was ill. Emil, the family doctor, who's David Glasser's father, got in touch with Beatty and Yudel Hertz, the grandparents. And next thing was that Yudel Hertz, Leslie's father, came down to Leicester in a train. And here is Yudel Hertz with Ken back in those days. Really sweet little photo. Muriel Barr, Leslie's wife, Muriel, met him in the taxi at the station and said, "Thank you for coming. I'm Leslie's doctor, and I'm also his wife, and you've got 3 grandchildren." And that's the first time that he knew about the family, and the first that the family knew that they had Jewish grandparents and Jewish relatives. So I'm hoping that Barbara and the others will say something about this at the end. The family, after that, the family started going up to Glasgow and visiting the rest of the Scottish Jewish family. Doreen particularly remembers them when they came up. The sad thing was that by the time they started travelling up to Glasgow, Beatty, Leslie's mum, was housebound on the 4th floor of their tenement building in Dundrennan Avenue, and Leslie was in a wheelchair. So although the children met the grandparents, there was never a proper reunion between Leslie and Beatty. The nearest they got was Leslie on the footpath outside waving up to his mother, which must have been completely heartbreaking. There's another outmarriage story with Harold and Morrie Hopestone. Their parents both died when they were young. They both told me that probably they wouldn't have married out if their parents had still been alive. They both went to their mother's sister at the time when they'd chosen their life partners to get married, and they said, and they had more or less the same conversation with her, that I'm in love and you can't stop me marrying this lady, and that's happened. Betty, I don't know if Betty was able to get in here tonight. I think she was 90 last week, and she came to the practice last week. It was lovely to see her. So Betty married Morrie, and it was interesting that she told me that her family was as miffed at her marrying into a Jewish family as Morrie's family was at him marrying out. Both of the Hopestone brothers talked to me about how they felt that they'd been cut off by the Hoppenstein family. But again, Uncle Moss went to visit both of these families and seemed to be everybody's favourite uncle. And David and Ivor and David Stone have all got things to say about their favourite Uncle Moish. And I've actually got a recording of him on a radio programme about Glasgow Jewry, but I was trying to get a record to produce his voice here, but it was too quiet and I couldn't manage to amplify it enough to produce it here. Obviously, there was loads more in the PhD. I had chapters about work life, religious life, home life, food and memory. And I also discovered this little play theory here in the food research, something about reverse Proustian memory. So, you know, in Proust, he eats a Madeleine and remembers his grandmother. So in all of my interviews, people talked about their grandmother, and what in summoning up their grandmother into their memories, they literally remembered the food and that their grandmother cooked and the taste of that food. And I had so many descriptions of cakes, different food, crepefolks, and different food that that everybody's grandmothers would make when they came. So it's reverse Proustian food memory, I think. And of course, with the PhD, you have to have some analysis and not just tell stories. So there was one time early on in the process, after I'd transferred from Manchester to the Strathclyde Scottish Oral History Centre, which I love the Scottish Oral History Centre, I was doing an upgrade interview with my academic panel. And I remember very clearly there was a terrible atmosphere. They were saying my analysis was poor or non-existent, and I thought they were going to throw me off the programme. And then after 45 minutes of that, it all changed. And they said, okay, apart from all that, we want to offer you a prize for the quality of your data collection, because no one in their department had ever done a project like this, tracking down a whole family down 5 generations. And they gave me prize money, which meant that I ended up visiting Leslie in Cape Town, having only interviewed her by phone, which was wonderful. Of course, I did end up having some analysis in the PhD. I used Bourdieu, who provides ideas about cultural capital, social capital, and economic capital. And thinking about this, it was very apparent that although all the families were very interested and engaged in Jewish learning, some of the families were much better off than others in the earlier generations. And I started looking at it more carefully. And it turned out that in every case, the men, apart from Aaron, who was the oldest son in the first generation to be born here, all the men, the children of Rabbi, the male children of Rabbi Zvi David and his wife Sophia, because of the Carnegie grants in Scotland that were there since 1902, they had a meritocracy in Scotland, and it meant that anybody who could get in was able to go to university. There were grants available. This happened a whole generation, or maybe even 2 generations, before the equivalent happened in England. So Scottish Jewish men were able to go to university and take up professions 1 or 2 generations before that was able to happen in England. All the men in the first generation went to university. They did sciences. They did really well. They won prizes. I've got a note here from the historian at Heriot Watt. Isaac was a busy chap that year. He scored 95% in first year mechanics, physics and chemistry. He won a medal for each, and he came second in his mathematics first year studies with 93%. And he won a medal in 1904 in inorganic chemistry with 85%. And Eva Hoppenstein was the only exception to this. The oldest daughter also went to Heriot Watt University, and she scored 74% in her junior German certificate, but she only studied for 2 years. It didn't make any difference to her economic benefit. She didn't study sciences, she didn't change her profession. All of these men became professionals. Marcus had originally wanted to become a doctor, but Arthur told us that he had to give up his studies and start work in order to support the rest of the family. So he set up and ran the Glasgow School of Optics in his home in Glasgow. All of those who married, which was Sydney, all the men who married, Sydney and Marcus, married daughters of well-off tradespeople, merchants in Glasgow or in Liverpool, and those families bought them or set them up in homes and supported them financially with their businesses. And in Bourdieu's terms, the men had embodied cultural and social capital, even if they didn't have economic capital. Their father didn't have money to give them. They had what he called embodied cultural and social capital, which is exactly the same as what my mum would have said. They were a good catch, they had good prospects, and they were able to get good marriages. As far as the girls went, they didn't get professional work or dowries. They worked in shops or were secretaries and before they got married, and they all married sons of working class traders in Glasgow, and they all lived in tenement flats in Glasgow near their parents. So there were cousins in the 3rd generation who grew up in completely different types of housing and lifestyles, either detached and main door houses in Liverpool or Glasgow versus tenement flats. And it happened again in the next generation. The sons of the female Hoppensteins went to university, got professions and married daughters of middle-class traders who were able in most cases to buy them houses, and the daughters didn't, and it took another generation for all of the girls and boys all to have equality in educational opportunities. So I remember very clearly my aunt Hannah Frank talking about how she and my uncle Lionel had planned to buy their house on a mortgage, but my grandmother bought it for them outright. So that was an example of my grandfather had a camera shop, and it was an example of well-off trading family supporting a professional. My uncle was a maths teacher. So I sort of recorded this phenomenon and called it, for the sake of analysis, intergenerational class shift due to gendered educational opportunities. I'll repeat that. Intergenerational class shift due to gendered educational opportunities. And it satisfied the people on my academic board that I'd learned about analysis. I've also been a bit of a historical detective through this work. It didn't just come about because of the coincidence of my first 3 interviews being related. There were loads of coincidences and stories that I heard from different people, the same story, different stories. And I'm not going to tell any more stories. I'm going to just show a couple more photos of the family, and then I'm going to show it. I'm going to show you. I'm going to hand it over to members of the family. Yes, wouldn't it be nice if I could actually share this? Here we go. Share. I think that's working. No, that didn't work. share screen. Microsoft, this is what I'm trying to share. So this is Fred Stone with his oldest nephew, with his oldest grandchild, Ivor and Jenny, David Stone's son and his wife doing the great thing, which is a mixture of Scottish and Jewish wedding culture, which is the kilt up on the dancing chairs at a wedding, and Ivor and Jenny's oldest daughter Sophie getting married in a beautiful East End shul, East End of London shul. And I would now, before I hand back to David to chair the meeting and take questions, I'd like to just hand over to any of the family who would like to unmute, and I think I might spotlight you all. If you unmute yourselves, I'll spotlight you and you can come on and just tell us about maybe how you found it being part of the research or anything that you'd like to add. So,
Fiona, I'll start. I found it really, it was such a privilege when Fred Stone introduced me to you, and it was just an amazing coincidence that I'd met Fred professionally. Of course, he was a very eminent child psychiatrist, and I'd heard a lot about him, and I did know about him, but it was an amazing, really an amazing coincidence. So yes, and I suppose the privilege that I hadn't had in my childhood to kind of meet people again, meet second cousins and meet the family who I had met as a child. But the real privilege of meeting Ivor and Jenny, David and Jenny's family, and really all of you that came to my house in London. Such a privilege to be involved in the research.
thank you. Anybody else want to come and?
Yeah, I'd kind of sort of echo that, and in so much as that, in a way, it's really nice that you did all the hard work for finding out about a branch of the family. You know, it's kind of thing when you're younger, you might not be so interested in, but as you get older, these things seem to be more pertinent. And it's nice now we kind of got a permanent record in the family. I think my eldest son, Max, who coincidentally lives in Aberdeen, actually.
Right.
I think he has been on the call anyway. So it's nice that, you know, even if he may not be, he's interested enough to join now, but even if they're not that interested when they're a bit younger, you know, it's good just to have it on record. So, and it was quite fun talking to you because it's kind of a little bit like family therapy as well, or group therapy, where you get to sort of pour your heart out about your miserable or otherwise upbringing and, you know, what it is. I think the quote you had earlier about belonging and not belonging is massively true, particularly coming from a family that was half in, half out, half Jewish, half not Jewish, etc., etc. So yeah, it's been really good to be part of it.
Yeah. Okay. Anybody else want to speak?
Can I say, I think just going back to what Hugh was saying about that outsider, wherever I am thing, it sort of chimed in with what you were saying earlier that Lionel had said about, you know, if you grew up Jewish in Glasgow and you went to the local school, you weren't a Protestant or a Catholic, but you were asked, are you a Protestant Jew or a Catholic Jew?
Yeah.
And you weren't quite sure what to say. And I remember from a young age being a wee bit rebellious and thinking, I'm not the same. And when we had a spelling test and I was asked to spell Bible, I spelt it with a small b on purpose, because I thought, this isn't my Bible you're talking about, Mrs. Simpson. So you can belt me if you want. And belt me she did. And then I suppose later on, when Hamish, a wee boy, went to Edinburgh and has been there many a year, we got to know lots of the parts of Edinburgh where the Hoppensteins first arrived. many of the streets where they lived in. And it's just amazing walking around there thinking 100 years ago, there would have been a guy looking a bit like me, you know, another weirdo walking around in Edinburgh trying to sell jewelry or something. And I sort of make that connection with Edinburgh, that, and thanks to Hamish. And we're going there in 2 days' time. So we'll do that again.
Great. Who's next? And also I'm going to tell the Hertzes that Cynthia Ross, who's in the audience, is a relative of Udall Hertz. And I've got her email address to send on to you. Who's next?
Hi, Fiona.
Hi. Oh, yay.
Hi, Leslie here.
Okay, I'll spotlight you.
I'm very interested in what Hugh said. I'd like to echo my cousin Hugh saying belonging or not belonging, because I was brought up without any sense of religion at all. And yet, through various intriguing circumstances, I came to marry into a Jewish family in Cape Town. And I decided I would like to come and live in Cape Town, and I was thoroughly entranced with the idea of visiting something I had wanted to do since I was 14, and that was to decide to belong. At the age of 14, I bought myself a Star of David, a little silver Star of David, and I wore it against probably my parents' wishes. I had no opportunity to be involved with the Jewish religion at all in my growing up, but I didn't know whether I belonged or didn't belong to anything. I was this betwixt and between person, and I actually wanted an identity, and I chose, to my mother's chagrin, that I wanted to be Jewish. So when I did come to Cape Town and I brought my daughter here, by a strange twist of law, I was able to study Judaism for a year, convert in the Reform sense, and give her a birth certificate in South Africa. So she was born twice. She was born once in England, once again in South Africa by a quirk of law, and became Jewish by the time she was 6. So my ability to convert when I came here kind of fulfilled a wish that I'd had since I was 14 to belong.
And it's fascinating as well, because mostly the families that marry out are kind of lost to the story. And what I've done here is managed to unlose it. And you were never lost, you know. You were,
no,
the Hoppensteins
but
and things were absolutely not lost, but they tend to be kind of discounted in some narratives. I think we've got time for one more family member before we hand it over to the audience, to the wider audience for questions. Who's
Don't mind speaking.
Yay.
Me? Am I on?
You're on. Thank you, David.
So I'm David. A couple of quick stories about being an outsider and belonging and all that. The school I went to in Shawlands in Glasgow, it was in a semi, not in really a Jewish area, but there was a smattering of Jews. And so in the school, in each year, there were maybe a handful of Jews. So in the whole school, there may be 30 Jews covering all the ages. So we used to have our Jewish service where the Protestants, generally Protestants, would stay in class, and the Jews would leave the class at 9 o'clock and go to our room where a Reverend, Mr. Mediski, would give us Hebrew prayers and Hebrew chat for half an hour, and then we'd come back into the main room. But there were occasions when Mr. Mediski wasn't present. He might have been off sick or whatever, on holiday or whatever. And on those occasions, we had to remain in the main class. So we didn't know what to do because we didn't know the prayers and we didn't know the tunes, the songs or anything. And I was at the back of the class, and there was one other Jewish girl in the class, and she was way over on the other side of the class. And basically, she looked up to me because I had a Jewish upbringing and she didn't. She looked up to me to guide her as to which of the prayers and psalms we were allowed to sing. And I deduced which ones we were allowed to sing because I scanned each one to see if it mentioned the word Jesus or not. And I'd scanned it in the beginning, and then I'd look over to it and I'd say, you can't do this one. It says Jesus. You can't do that one. So that was that one. And just finally on the family thing and how it all sort of interconnects and these coincidences and all that. So my well, I've got a son called Daniel, and my wife has got a brother called John, and John has a daughter called Katie. Now, why is that relevant? It's relevant because that means that my son Daniel and John's son Katie are first cousins. But John's wife, Katie's mother, is from Leicester. So, and we worked out that she's related to the Lightstones, which goes all the way up to the Hoppensteins. So my son is not only related directly to Katie as first cousins, but also related all the way up to the top of that family tree to Rabbi Svi and back down again.
Fab, thank you. Hamish or anybody, was there one more person from the family that wanted to say anything? Otherwise, I'll hand it back to my chair.
I'll just say, David's story is a fascinating one because it's through my wife. She's from Leicester, so that's how I'm related to David's kids. My wife's kids are related to his sister's kid. But the story which David just mentioned was similar to me. I brought up in a Jewish family, Orthodox family, went to an Orthodox shul. I then went off to yeshiva for some time as well. But when I was at school, I never went to a Jewish school. But there were a lot at school in South Manchester, similar to David's in Glasgow, a few Jews in each year. Didn't really make high profile, but we didn't even have a Jewish assembly. But one day somebody asked me to come along to a Christian Union meeting, and knowing that I was interested in religion, I went along, not realizing I was going to be targeted. And the whole talk was aimed at me, trying to get me to convert. Presented a book about a Jewish person in America who had converted to Christianity, and it was inscribed in the front of the book, "Church's ministry amongst the Jews." So you can be part of the inside, but you're also on the outside, and you don't belong. I mean, as the last few weeks have probably shown to a lot of people in this country how uncomfortable it can be at times.
Great, and on that,
Big thanks to Fiona for what she's done, making us meet all the different bits of the family.
thank you. And on that happy note, it's been an absolute privilege to do it with the family and to be able to. And I did the PhD. I want to hold this up. I did the PhD, which was just for me really, but I did the book for the family, and every time there's a new baby, I do a little family tree and send it off and print it out and send it off to them, and have to keep updating the family tree. So it's been lovely to be part of it. It's been fantastic to do it. This has been such a nice evening. We got an hour together as the family beforehand. It's been an absolute privilege and wonderful to be part of this project.